You're listening to episode 104 of Bionic Planet, about halfway through season 9. Today's episode is called Transformational, How Carbon Finance Really Works, with my old boss, David Antonioli, the former CEO of standard-setting body Vera, who now runs a company called Transition Finance.
Man may be unwittingly changing the world's climate through the waste products of his civilization.
There's a group of us now who are proposing that the Earth has actually entered a new epoch, and that is the Anthropocene.
We know that the enemy is carbon, and we know its ugly face. We should put a big fat price on it, and of course, add to that, drop the subsidies.
In episode 90 of Bionic Planet, we met Kenyan agronomist George Thumbi, who is helping farmers in Kenya's Kasigao Corridor Red Plus Carbon Project improve their yields by shifting to agroforestry and other forms of sustainable land management. Those activities dramatically increase the amount of carbon locked in soils. But that impact doesn't factor into the project's carbon accounting. And stuff like this happens all the time. In episode 78, we saw how Guatemalan conservationist Marco Cerezo is using carbon finance to help farmers demarcate their land and save surrounding forests. But the only carbon credits he generates are those from impacts on the farms themselves, not the surrounding forest. Everything else is a bonus, a positive externality that critics of carbon finance choose to ignore. They basically ignore the entire rationale for nature-based climate solutions, namely that your benefits multiply over time to far exceed the credits generated. That's partly because the voluntary carbon market emerged to spark the kinds of changes that weren't being initiated any other way, and efforts to implement them focused narrowly on carbon benefits that could be estimated using existing deforestation risk models. Today's guest, David Antonioli, has been working the climate puzzle for 30 years. He's rolling out a series of papers and a project called Financing the Transitions the World Needs Towards a New Paradigm for Carbon Markets. As always with this guy, I found our conversation humbling, enlightening, and, most importantly, easy to follow. Quick note, we spoke last week, so when he talks about next week, he means this week, which won't matter in a few weeks anyway.
I'm David Antonioli. I'm an advisor on climate change, helping companies, nonprofits, governments use innovative early-scale financing to ensure proper transitions of the economy. And of course, as a great example of the early-scale financing, carbon credits would be the perfect one. So, I was the CEO of Vera for 14 and a half years. I stepped down last June. Before that, I worked for EcoSecurities, and prior to that with the USAID. So I've got about 30 years experience working on climate change, and 25 of those are specifically looking at carbon markets. So I've took the time to reflect and think about stuff, and have now put a bunch of my reflections on paper, and I'm publishing them as a series. The first chapter was published last week on the 4th of June, and then the next one will be coming out every Tuesday until the first week of July.
And this first installment is called Financing the Transitions the World Needs Towards a New Paradigm for Carbon Markets. And you open by describing two ways that carbon finance is designed to work. The first is what I've tended to call catalytic finance, but you're calling transformational finance, where you're paying to create something like agroforestry that you can eventually kick out of the nest. It can fly away without carbon finance, and it may even reproduce someplace else. And the other is more like an ongoing service that will never fly on its own, like industrial carbon capture and storage, which exists only to capture carbon and store it. So there's no other income streams that are going to come in for it to fly on its own, right? I mean, that's the basic divide that you've got.
Yes, and I haven't gotten into this yet because this hasn't been published yet, but I do put forth some ideas for those activities that otherwise don't have an underlying economic value. Mm-hmm. So you're right. There's some activities that we can catalyze and enable the proper transition of an entire sector. In those cases, market forces should help to kind of create the foundation that will allow those sectors to evolve. And then there's some cases where you just don't have that, right? But I think there's actually three categories. So there's the activities that have an underlying economic benefit or value that are just not happening at first because it's too risky or the costs are too high or people aren't familiar with the technology or people don't have the capacity to implement it, whatever it might be. And so for those, introduce the technology, bring down costs, get experience, de-risk future investments, and then they can go off to the races. The second category are projects that don't have any kind of underlying economic activity. And when the crediting period ends, there's a risk that they will no longer continue. And the example I set out in the chapter I published this week was a landfill gas project, capture and destruction. And some of the projects I worked on when I was at EcoSecurities, once the crediting period ended or the project ended, they are mothballed. So nobody was there to pick up the slack. And so the next chapter, the one I'm talking about in 2 weeks' time, not next week, but the week after, we'll talk about potential solutions for that. And one of those, not to give away the punchline, is that I think we need to properly engage with governments. And governments can actually use carbon finance, including from the voluntary and the compliance markets under Article 6.2, in a way that basically brings them on to regulating these sectors of the economy. In the case of the landfill gas project that I was describing, it was in Mexico. And, we established a 10-year crediting period because when we developed the project in 2006, there was a regulation in Mexico that said, thou shalt capture and destroy the landfill gas. But we looked around the country and said, nobody's doing this. So we make the case, hey, this is a regulation, it's not enforced. Can we get the credits? The CDM said, fine, I think it was the right decision. But we assumed that in 10 years' time, the government would say, okay, now we're going to enforce this. Well, guess what? It didn't happen. But now, with pressures under the Paris Agreement and the fact that governments are starting to realize that they do need to start to take this more seriously, maybe governments might be willing to say, you know what, I will make a regulation. I'll either enforce it if it exists now or create a regulation and I'll enforce it when the project ends. And I think that could actually crowd in a lot of investment because it would basically give more confidence to people that this will have a long-term run. So those are the two kinds of projects. The third one, which is kind of unique and which I am not sure I have the answer to, is projects that generate removals exclusively. Because in a net zero world, we're going to need loads more removals than what we have today. We've reduced our emissions ideally by 90 or 95%, whatever number you want to pick. And the remaining we're removing from the atmosphere every year. So those projects have a potential much longer lifespan and time frame. And maybe they can generate credits for a long, long time, much longer than a normal 10 or 20 year crediting period. So that's just to frame how I see different projects lining up.
And for removals, do you mean industrial carbon capture and storage or also nature-based?
So natural too, whether it's biochar, soil carbon, forest restoration. Sure, I think those are just as legitimate.
Okay, so you've got forest restoration where you're actually bringing back a degraded forest with native plants. But you've also got things like sustainable timber harvesting on degraded lands with harvested wood products locking up the wood for decades to come. But that's, I guess, a whole different dynamic, right? I mean, that's
true. But if you take a degraded land and you're starting to plant trees and you create some timber, I think that's okay. It depends on what the objectives are. If you're insisting that it's all native species, well, then that's kind of a rewilding effort. I think that's more of a kind of a pure removal activity, and that should have value in the market somewhere. But I think there'll be different flavors of that. One of the arguments I make in a future chapter is that for natural climate solutions, to enable this proper transition, we need to break down the silos that exist between forest conservation projects, reforestation projects, agroforestry, regenerative agriculture. We've got too many silos that don't enable a project to manage an entire landscape in a holistic fashion and really capture and leverage the different sources of financing that they can get from the different activities that they could implement. And I actually think that we're undermining the ability of carbon finance to really help drive the transition in those sectors of the economy.
Can I ask a provocative question about a specific critic? And if you don't like it, you can decline to answer.
No, sure, go ahead.
There's an argument out there, most vociferously made by two outfits, Carbon Plan and Carbon Direct, that natural climate solutions and reductions-based credits more broadly can never be recognized because of all the intermingled income streams. And in their view, that makes additionality so confusing and so convoluted that it's impossible to isolate, and therefore we shouldn't even try. I mean, that's essentially their argument. They'll say I'm oversimplifying, but I'd argue that I'm just stating it simply. Carbon Direct has expanded recently from purely industrial carbon capture and storage to rewilding, but they're emphasizing that they're only doing rewilding because the additionality is clear. And they even took a swipe at sustainable timber harvesting and the whole catalytic approach. And I'm wondering if you'd care to address their argument that catalytic finance is just too messy to include in carbon payments.
I fundamentally disagree with that premise. And I think by saying that, no, we're not going to really touch any activity that has any kind of economic benefit, we are essentially undermining our ability to drive the kinds of businesses of the future. And that applies to natural climate solutions or industrial applications or anything, right? And I actually think that we need to be using carbon for many things, but one of them is let's use carbon to create the businesses of the future. The carbon finance is a really unique source of financing. It's nimble, it's effective, it delivers the benefits to where you need it. Why not use it for these purposes?
Right.
This view that, you can only do stuff that's highly additional, meaning there's no other economic benefit, I think is a short-sighted view. And I think we're missing the ability to use carbon in a thoughtful manner. And I think here's the other thing where I differ strongly with that perspective. Because let's just say, for example, that we take let's take regenerative ag, that presumably has some sort of economic benefit, because even though it's risky and costly at first, right, and your yields will go down and it'll be like in a tough situation, over time, ideally, from what I understand, is that farmers are better off. They have diversified their income because they're planting different types of crops. They're better prepared for floods and droughts. Their yields may come back up. So it is a good thing. And we can use carbon to help them kind of bridge that gap, right? So now let's just assume that in a particular region, we have a theory that says, well, in order to get all farmers to adopt this, we need to get 15% of the farmers to adopt these regenerative practices. Well, if we have that theory and it's based on rigorous academic research and understanding of how farmers basically make decisions, how these things flip, well, guess what? If we reach that 15% threshold, then you're able to flip everybody else. You stop crediting or you stop approving new projects once you hit 15%, but then everybody else comes along. And why? Because you will have introduced the practice sufficiently to make it understandable and not risky. By introducing it, you will have built a series of businesses that are designed around supporting people making this transition, right? Maybe you've got local banks who are willing to say, oh, you want to do regenerative agriculture? I'll give you a loan. If you go to a bank today and say, oh, hey, I want to do regenerative agricultural practice, they'll tell you you're crazy, right? But if there's enough activity that we're starting to build that confidence in this activity, maybe finances are available. So you basically de-risk the whole thing, and the whole sector can basically blossom and operate on this basis without carbon finance. Now, if you are able to achieve that, and let's just say even if you don't flip 100% of the farmers, let's say you flip 60% of the farmers, well, guess what? Now you have 3 times the emission reductions that you paid for. That, to me, is a much better bargain than having to fight about every single ton and being very purist about it. Because, again, we're missing the forest for the trees. And that ultimately is the challenge that we're facing. Carbon finance, as it's viewed today, which is limited to enabling a company to make a compensation claim, is limited by its very definition. So I actually think that we can rethink parts of the carbon credit, not all of it. I think a lot of it really works very well. We can rethink parts of it to really enable the kinds of transitions the world needs.
Yeah. Back in 2011, I looked at soil carbon projects in Kenya, which is, regenerative agriculture. And the farmers there were reticent. They were saying that they told me they all cared about one thing, yields. And if, we talked longer, it was really two things, yields and risk. But they were reticent about joining the project because it would require them to change everything they did on their farms. And they didn't know if it was going to work or not, and they were nervous. Now, in this particular case, they were implementing agroforestry, which, planting trees in among crops, fruit trees for silage and cows. And, the trees fix nitrogen, they bring shade, and they had like a Goldilocks kind of thing where everything worked out for them. And when I went back in 2016, everything was different. And, the farmers who didn't join at first because they said they needed to physically see what this was all about, they were like, wow, look, yours is an oasis. Mine's like a desert. And you could see it. You could really see where the agroforestry had been implemented and where the old methods were still being applied. And if you listen to some of those episodes, what you hear is that the direct carbon payments themselves were negligible. Farmers were really skeptical about whether they'd even see those. And what they wanted was some proof of concept and some kind of risk sharing so that if things didn't work, they wouldn't be left with a plot of land that wasn't producing. And mention all this because this was my direct experience, but then it really crystallized when Vera was developing VM42, which is the new regenerative agriculture methodology, which I've also covered on the show. And I remember reading those public consultation documents, and people were citing research from everywhere, from Poland, from the United States, and basically showing that what farmers need to make a change is to see their neighbors succeeding.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah.
You can learn more about the topics I just alluded to in 3 particular episodes. Episode 89, called How Agroforestry is Reshaping the Kenyan Countryside. Episode 81, called How to Build a Methodology. And Episode 53, called A Marshall Plan for Forests. These episodes look at A, how Kenyan farmers view change, B, how the views of farmers in general informed the public consultation on Vera's regenerative agriculture methodology, and C, the catalytic role of carbon finance that David is discussing today. I've spent the past 20 years deep in the weeds of climate and biodiversity finance, and while it's great to see these issues finally bursting into mainstream awareness, they can be difficult to understand without context. The biggest problem is that they're often presented in isolation from each other, instead of as part of a global mosaic of interlocking solutions. Another problem is that to understand these, you really need to come at them from multiple perspectives, or multiple buckets, as Robert Sapolsky would put it. He is a biologist, neurologist, and primatologist who writes and teaches about human behavior. In his online lectures and his best-selling book, Behave, he talks about what he calls disciplinary buckets that offer legitimate but irreconcilably different theories of human behavior. He takes us on a journey into different buckets, some in the field of neuroscience, some in the field of evolutionary psychology, and some in the field of moral philosophy. And in the end, after he spills you from bucket to bucket, you end up with a slurry of understanding that reflects all of these buckets but conforms to none exclusively. Environmental finance is like that too. It encompasses human behavior, biology, physics, forestry, cosmology, epistemology, politics, and last but not least, causal inference and land change modeling. I don't claim to have mastered all these buckets, and I can say with absolute certainty that the more you learn, the more you realize how little you know, and how dangerously destructive it is to think otherwise. In our last episode, we looked at pragmatists versus purists, and that's a theme that emerged today when we start looking at sustainable timber harvesting versus rewilding, both of which have value in different circumstances. The value I bring to this is a holistic understanding of how carbon finance dovetails with biodiversity finance, with water finance, and with supply chain interventions and government policies. I know enough about the different buckets to differentiate between truths and cherry-picked or idealized findings and opinions. If you think I'm doing a good job of helping people see the signal through the noise, and you want more and better episodes, then you can help me deliver them by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Bionic Planet. That's patreon.com/Bionic Planet. Likewise, if you're an ethical business looking to reach a global, climate-aware audience, then reach out to me about sponsorship opportunities. You can reach me at steve@bionic-planet.com. Once again, those two addresses, if you want to become a patron and support me as an individual, it's patreon.com, patreon.com/Bionic Planet, and there Bionic Planet is all one word, no dots or dashes. If you want to learn about sponsorship opportunities or even advertising, reach out to me at steve@bionic-planet.com, and I'll share my sponsorship packages with you. Now back to David Antonioli.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately we need to ask ourselves the question, what are we trying to achieve, right? And again, if you think we're trying to achieve a ton that someone can use to compensate, that leads you down one road. And I think it's very much the road that we're on right now. And it's about, integrity, and that's fine. But if you ask the question, are we trying to achieve a deeper transition or the transitions that the world really needs? Then that may lead you down a different pathway. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't care about integrity. Like, I'm not saying that we should just approve any activity, right? If an activity kind of can stand on its own, there's no reason to support it at the beginning, well, then I'm fine. We should not approve that. But we should have a theory of change for those activities that do have a long-term underlying economic value to them, because I think those are in many ways the kinds of businesses that we want to support and we can support through carbon. But again, it depends on what the question you're asking. Now, again, that does mean we need to rethink the additionality or the methodologies that are enabling all this stuff, because I do think that there are some weaknesses in them, in particular, the fact that they don't take into account what happens when the carbon crediting ends. They're not preparing the sector to really make that transition.
Yeah, one thing that gnawed at me while reading this is that the land change projects that I know best and that I featured on the show, they already operate on a theory of change and are designed to be what you're calling transformative. I mean, one is the Chulu Hills project in southern Kenya, another is the Kasigao Corridor project, which is very close by. Both of them are using carbon finance to shift the local economies. They're introducing beekeeping, sustainable agriculture, ecotourism, agroforestry, and they're doing all these things that over a period of 15, 20, 30 years should eventually become self-sustaining. But at the same time, they have some activities like ranger patrols, bursaries for kids to go to college, and things that aren't going to become self-sustaining, or I can't see how they would be. So to me, these projects, they've always been designed to be transformational, and I'm wondering to what extent this isn't so much a new paradigm as one that's always been there, but it's never really been explicit before.
Man, I think you captured it. That last word, I think, is a key one, explicit, right? I think that paradigm or that thinking is implicit in what we want to do. And when you talk to people, people saying, oh yeah, we're doing all this great stuff. We're basically implementing, sustainable agriculture or all this good stuff. And that's great. That's wonderful. And certainly we need to support that. However, the system is not explicitly designed to ensure that everybody is doing that. And I think we do need to recognize that this is a market where you have private sector participants. In some cases, when it comes to deciding whether a project generates a ton or enables that transition, if you're a project developer, you're probably going to take the first one as the primary driver and the transitional piece as the ancillary or secondary driver consideration. So I think we need to build it into the system to ensure that these transitions happen. Now, one of the weaknesses that we have in the system is that we've created these silos. So Chulu Hills, Kasigao, those are both forest conservation efforts. And those are great. You get credit for avoiding the destruction of forests. Great. However, those projects, and I've not followed them recently, this may have changed, but if those projects are doing any kind of reforestation or agroforestry or regenerative agriculture, guess what? In order to capture those benefits, they have to write another project description, and they have to get another auditor and go through the process to do all the validation and verification, which is very painful.
Yeah.
And so what's happening is that you've got initiatives like those that have the potential to generate additional revenue and further reinvest that in, scaling their activities, scaling the restoration efforts, scaling the nurseries. All those things would be really powerful because they give a lot more economic heft to this restoration conservation template that they're developing. And I would venture to say that would further increase the ability of that in that particular sector of the economy to transition to a sustainable model that's not dependent on carbon credits. Because, you mentioned this, how some of those projects are actually building schools, paying for teachers. Mm-hmm. Some projects have health clinics. You got to pay for rangers. That costs money.
Yeah.
And as much as I would love to think that the ability to create ecotourism and regenerative agriculture or sustainable agricultural practices, I worry that those revenues and those benefits are not going to be sufficient to sustain those other activities like, the schools or whatever it may be that do require an influx of capital. So we need to figure out how to keep that going beyond the end of the project. And that's where the projects, we don't have those rules in place yet.
Yeah, and what you're describing, it sounds hypothetical, but it's exactly what's happening. If you look at, again, the Cascade Corridor project, they're doing extensive agroforestry to take the pressure off the forest, and they view the direct benefits of agroforestry as a positive externality. They don't, something they're doing that's adding value, but they don't quantify the impacts on the individual farms. They only quantify what's happening in the forest because it was just too difficult to do this, and the variables are all over the place. So these positive externalities are common, and they just don't factor into the carbon accounting.
It's interesting. Yeah, it's fascinating because I think the construct that we've built has forced folks like in the Cascade part say, "Oh, look, we've got all these other benefits we're generating," and that's true. But those are other benefits. In some cases, that's money we're leaving on the table. That's money we could use to actually further demonstrate that this new economy is the way we can work and transform the world. And again, going back to your point about not recognizing any kind of activity that has an economic value. Restoring degraded lands, even if you're not rewilding them, restoring some degraded lands is really hard work, even if you're going to rewild them. And that does not pay out. Just from a financial perspective, doesn't pencil out in many cases. So I do think that we need to really embrace the kinds of projects that have a long-term economic viability, because I think that's, I think otherwise we're just, playing at the margins. Now, of course, again, just to repeat, we can't just approve anything that has an economic value. It's got to have some serious obstacles. But if it does, like regenerative ag, I think it's perfectly reasonable to be supporting those kinds of projects, particularly if you end up achieving the broader transformation of the sector, because you pay for part of it, but you get all these other benefits, all these greenhouse gas benefits in the example before. If you pay for 15%, but 60% switch, you just multiply your benefits by 3.
Yeah,
that's not a bad deal.
Right. Yeah, and again, the research is there to back that up. And not just in carbon. You get outside of carbon, you get into biodiversity benefits and also water, which I know we've talked about a lot one-on-one in the past. And there was a white paper that came out a couple of years ago. I can't remember the name of the author. I'll put it in the show notes. But they looked at the water benefits coming out of the Chulu Hills because, the Chulu Hills are a cloud forest. And in restoring the forest, what they've revived the water supplies that go all the way to Mombasa, and they're arguing in this paper, and again, it's not put out by the project proponent, I don't think there's any affiliation that I know of, that the water benefits in terms of economic impact in Mombasa far outweigh any carbon payments that are coming in, but that's treated as this kind of nebulous co-benefit rather than something that's quantified. I'm wondering if we should be looking at issues like stacking and bundling, which kind of fell out of favor for a while, but seems to be coming back.
Yeah, I think in some ways you can avoid having to decide that. I mean, if we use carbon thoughtfully to enable the transition, then you've demonstrated an economic model. Now, yes, in a perfect world, Mombasa is paying for the water services that are happening upstream or up in the hills. That again requires regulatory, government approval, entrenched interest, all those things that make things really complicated. So, I think the beauty of the carbon markets is that they can actually move capital to doing things. Now, maybe you could have a situation, which actually you made me think about this, was really interesting. Let's take Mombasa, right? Maybe Mombasa realizes that the benefits of protecting Chula Hills are pretty significant for its water resources. So Mombasa might say, you know what? I recognize those benefits. I don't have the money to do that today. But if you implement this project for the next 30 years, I will pay for those environmental services in 30 years. I will commit to doing that. Now, all of a sudden, there's your transition, right? All of a sudden, Chula Hills knows that if they maintain that forest for 30 years, the government's going to step up. Now, again, will the government ever do it? And that's a whole different kettle of fish, but at least you've got a signal. But let's assume that happens, right? Mombasa says, I will implement a regulation in 30 years. My people will say, well, you're crazy. How's that going to happen? 30 years, government's changed. That's true. But what if we created a trust fund? What if we said, okay, if you're going to do that, we're going to hold you to a set of milestones that you're going to implement over the next 30 years so that on year 30, when this project closes, right, there are capable government staff, but basically the people who are working on the project, instead of working for the project, they work for the government, right? And there's a seamless transition so that everything that's been put into place over the 30 years of the project now has government backing. And we have milestones that measure that every 2, 5, 10 years. You've got those milestones written out. And you're depositing money into a trust fund that's going to enable the government to pay for those employees and pay for those services. Right. Now, if you have that model, that does two really important things. First of all, for the buyers of those credits, if you have a buyer buying a credit from a project that doesn't have such a kind of agreement with government versus one that does, I'll bet you soup to nuts that the buyers are going to go for the one that's got their support from the government. Because they know that, hey, this means that my investment in this conserving this forest means that there's a long-term play for this forest. The second thing it does is that it reduces the buffer contribution because all of a sudden the risk profile of that project's gone way down. There's more credits to sell. So you get a higher price, there's more credits to sell. Guess what? Park that extra benefit in a trust fund that it's invested in. When the project ends, the government can use that trust fund to support all of the activities that have been done. There's creative ways of solving these things. And it's not going to work everywhere. Not all Mombasas are going to say that. But I think the challenge is, or the opportunity is to find those governments that are willing to make that kind of commitment and make that happen. Because again, I think those governments are going to be the ones that are going to be the leaders. They're going to be the ones who are able to crowd in this limited environmental finance, which I think is really critical and it presents a huge opportunity.
Yeah. And I know Tanzania has actually done a lot of work on payments for watershed services. So there's a precedent for it in that area. But I feel like I'm getting away from your paper here on the need to be explicit about transformative finance. Maybe we could also be more explicit about what you think can be different from what we've done so far. What are some of the things that you're proposing, maybe in layman's terms?
So I think that there's a few things. So the first thing is that we need to design the system so that we have a game plan for what happens when the music stops, when carbon finance is no longer available, right? When projects no longer become additional. So what happens at that stage? And so we need to design the market so that we're driving finance that can introduce technologies, reduce costs, build capacity, de-risk investment, basically. That should be the frame. And so, but we don't have that right now because the predominant way of determining whether projects are eligible for carbon financing is the project by project approach,
Mm-hmm.
which limits your ability to look at the big picture because you're looking at every individual project, and doesn't effectively look at what happens when this is over. Have we built the foundation for the future of the sector? It isn't designed to do that. Now, there's a certain logic to the additionality tool, and it's easy to use, but it's problematic because it doesn't answer the question about what happens at the end of the game.
Can you flesh that out a bit? Because I've talked about additionality a lot at a philosophical level, and I've looked at some of the research on common practice in regenerative agriculture that we already discussed, but I've never gone really deep into the nitty-gritty of things like existing additionality tools, what they do and don't do, and that looks like something you're going to be unpacking a lot in this series as it rolls out.
Sure. Well, just so we're clear, additionality is the concept that this project would not have been built had it not been for the existence of the ability to sell carbon finance. Boom. The additionality tool, which has been passed down from like more than 2 decades ago when the CDM was first built, and it has really changed very little, basically says, okay, take your project and analyze what are the obstacles it faces, and they have to be credible obstacles that you identify. And one of the ways that this has been presented or been used is you can go down the road of proving financial additionality. Like, this project without carbon finance isn't going to happen. But if you had carbon finance on top, it kind of hits the magical kind of IRR, needed IRR, and you're over the hump. And
which
you're
is
off to the
internal
races.
rate of return.
Yeah, internal rate of return. The problem with that approach is that inevitably it misses some of the bigger kind of structural challenges that new technologies and practices face.
Can you flesh this out with something concrete as well? I'm worried that it's becoming too abstract. I mean, I keep thinking, as we've been talking about this, for example, I've been thinking about some projects in Paraguay where they're trying to get people to shift from grazing cattle on degraded land to doing sustainable timber harvesting. And in this methodology, which was pioneered under the CDM, it's a relatively old one, but they looked at the rate of return for what they could get for staying with cattle, or what farmers could get for staying with cattle, and what they could get for shifting to timber. And they realized that the cattle was more profitable than timber, even though timber is regenerative relatively. I mean, they're not rewilding, they're not restoring the forest to its pristine natural state, but they're improving it. And the problem is that cattle grazing on these degraded lands are more profitable given the infrastructure in place and things like that. So to make that transition, they had to come up with something that would make the internal rate of return higher for sustainable timber harvesting than for cattle grazing, and that was where the additionality argument came in. So this to me is a really clear, vivid example, and I wonder if if you have a better one, or if you think that.
Yep. No, and that's a good example. That's a good example of demonstrating how something is, you need carbon finance to make something happen versus what is happening already. But the limitation of the current tool is that it doesn't say when this is going to stop.
Right.
So it doesn't really build the foundation you need so that all of the, degraded lands in Paraguay that are subject to cattle grazing actually get transformed into something that has a richer ecosystem, right? So we don't really define that because we're reducing it to each individual project. It's down to, assessing this particular intervention within its context, but over and over and over and over, which makes for which gets to the second point that the system that we've created, which requires the additionality tool, is very cumbersome. It's costly. It's time consuming, and it just creates for a really, really long process because you're assessing each individual project. Each individual assessment of this project requires that the people reviewing it have deep sector expertise.
Right.
So now you're saying, okay, we're taking this degraded land that's being used for cattle ranching, and we want to switch it to timber. So if you're assessing that, guess what? You have to understand the economics of cattle ranching. You have to understand the economics of sustainable timber. You have to understand what's going on in Paraguay. And every time you do this for every single project, you have to do this exercise over and over and over. And it just eats up a huge amount of time, which means that you just can't scale this because it's so complicated and cumbersome. And inevitably, in the case of financial additionality, you end up missing some key things. So, you might be able to say, well, in this case, you had the financial additionality. But even if it penciled out, how do you put the fact that the cattle ranchers are probably spending huge amounts of money lobbying the government to keep their ranching status, right? And that hardly gets captured in any kind of analysis. It really fails at looking at entrenched interests. So in many ways, the question, rather than diving down into each individual activity, I think the bigger question, we can flip the question around and say, look, what are we trying to achieve? We're trying to achieve a much more sustainable future. And in the case of lands that are being used for cattle ranching, we're trying to shift them to more sustainable practices. So how do we do that? Well, let's take these activities like, sustainable timber forest management. We could potentially just say, look, if we analyze at a sector-wide basis that this kind of makes sense, but it's not happening for a number of reasons, including lobbying and whatever it might be, well, then let's actually finance it so that it builds enough traction so that once you get to, maybe going back to the example of the regenerative agricultural farmers, maybe it's 15%, maybe it's 10%, maybe it's 18%. I don't know what the right number is. Let's just take 15% for now because it's a nice round number. If we actually are able to switch 15% of the lands in Paraguay that are currently being degraded lands, are being used for cattle ranching, and flip them to more more sustainable uses, well, maybe the other farmer by then, right, we will have introduced the practice. We will have demonstrated that works. We will have ideally created, maybe other funding sources. Maybe local banks are willing then to make loans to people who are saying, hey, I want to make the switch. Right now, that's not going to happen, but in the future, it might if you have that underlying foundation. And then you start to flip it. And so then all of a sudden, it becomes the natural thing to do. And people who are doing cattle ranching don't have to get pushed aside, but they're like, you know what? This is a better deal. It's a better deal. I'm signing up. So we need to be thinking about what the long-term objective is. And I think that's ultimately what's at the core of thinking about the broader transition.
Yeah. I mean, as we talk, I think a lot of things are kind of crystallizing in my own head, and this whole idea of implicit versus explicit. And what you're describing is also another thing that was hinted at and expected in those early projects, but it was nebulous. There was this idea that right now nothing's happening, and we hope the world is going in this direction. We want to spark something that will encourage early action so we can get these things going, and then in the future, it'll have more infrastructure for timber in this example. It'll be more economical. But I get the feeling that there was a sense that it was going to happen sometime down the road, but there wasn't a clear off-ramp, a map, clear exit strategy.
I'll give you another example. That's a great example right there. So let's just say we've got these projects, right? Well, the limitation on, if you're looking at it on an individualized project basis, it means it's really hard for anybody to make a long-term investment in the sector. So what does the sector need? Well, the sector needs nurseries, right? We need to invest in nurseries to make sustainable timber harvesting financially viable in the long term. You need loans, you need expertise. But if you're doing this on a project by project basis, an investor doesn't have that long-term view. Like, I don't know. I just don't know that there's going to be a market for the saplings I'm going to produce. However, if you say from the get-go, look, 15%, once we achieve, we'll credit things up until we achieve 50% market penetration or transition from degraded lands that are being used for cattle ranching to lands that are doing sustainable timber harvesting. Well, then all of a sudden, an investor is going to say, well, wait a minute, now this makes sense.
Right.
I can make a long-term investment in nurseries, in capacity, in whatever it is that you need to make this happen. And all of a sudden, you create the foundation. When you're doing it on a project-by-project basis, you're so in the weeds of the detail. Literally, again, we have lost the forest for the trees. We're so focused on every single little branch that we've lost what the bigger opportunity is.
Yeah. And again, I'm kind of getting it now. It's when we talk about transformation, it's not just project by project. What you keep coming back to is this idea of overhauling a local economy and trying to get everybody to a threshold point, sector wide in a region. Are there other procedures that should be coming into place, or is that something I guess you're going to be addressing in later chapters of this series as it rolls out?
No, it's exactly what I'm talking about in the chapter that comes out next Tuesday. It's basically putting out a model for this would work. The two really important things. One, you already mentioned. So this will require a fair bit of analysis, right? We have to really understand how markets flip generally, but then also how they might flip based on regional characteristics. So I was on the phone earlier today with someone who's talking about farmers in respect to regenerative ag, and how two different regions of the country are very different. One of them is much richer than the other, so the dynamics are different. So you'd probably want to separate out. Say, you've got the poorer side of the country and the richer side of the country, and the dynamics play out differently. Maybe there are different thresholds. They farm different things. So you want to create what I would call thoughtful simplifications. So you can't just say at the country, here's the whole level. You might do that if things are fairly similar, but there's some differences. Maybe you want to separate it out by region, but you can't go down to the farm by farm level. Or even the kind of municipality by municipality level. That's going to be too complicated. So there's got to be some thoughtful simplification that allows us to do that. But that does require a fair bit of research and understanding about what's happening. So it's about what are current practices, how do markets switch or flip. There's a great concept called positive tipping points that the team at Exeter University has popularized. The idea that, hey, at some point, you have enough interventions. At some point, you hit the positive tipping point, and things are off. You're off to the races. And that's essentially what I'm talking about. And I'm actually working with the team at University of Exeter to do the second thing that you mentioned, which is actually to do that study, which is, okay, how can we try to raise some resources and find some funding for this. But we're trying to pick out some sectors in some parts of the world that we can create a common theory of change backed up by robust data and research that you would ideally, in a perfect world, if I had my druthers, we could find that positive tipping point or that threshold at which the sector kind of hits the flywheel effect. So that would be the idea and how to get there. So we do need to do some work to kind of create that model, but I think it's eminently doable. But the other thing that I wanted to say is that we've got a model that already works like this pretty much. So people when they hear this, oh my God, you throw additionality at the one, not at all. Additionality is still a very fundamental concept. We've got to keep it because that's kind of the basis for what we're transacting. But we need to think about it differently. There's been some fantastic work already done in this context, particularly pioneered by the Climate Action Reserve, taken up by the California Resources Board. All of their methodologies are standardized methods, right? They basically take a positive list approach.
I haven't talked about what a positive list is.
A positive list is essentially a list of activities that are defined a priori or beforehand that are additional, right? So in the early days in California, the Climate Action Reserve said, landfill gas, right? It's not required by law. You can do landfill gas and you're in automatically. They did agricultural digesters. They're not happening. They're not around. You build a digester, you're in automatically. Coal mine methane and a bunch of other things that they've been able to do. And so Vera then took those rules and added some further guidelines. And so started looking at this question like when to stop. And so the Vera rules now set out that when you're looking at market penetration, you can't credit beyond 5% of market penetration. So they started to look at that. My point is that we have a model that works, this kind of positive list approach. The concern that people will say is that, positive lists were meant as a way to check additionality, not as a way to assess additionality. I actually think that we can use, or we should be using, positive lists as a way of fully assessing additionality. And if we do enough research at the front end that looks at sectors and, technologies or practices that are not common that we can get going through carbon finance, we should just credit them. And if we can set a threshold of market penetration, or however you want to define it, in a way that actually creates that flywheel effect, so that at some point you can be comfortable taking the foot off the accelerator and letting it all proceed on its own. But there is a model that already works, and we just need to scale it. And there's some new standards in the market that are trying these approaches, and that's great. But again, we need to be thoughtful as to how they consider the end game. Mm-hmm. And that, to me, is, once we figure that out, the end game to me is a situation where you don't need carbon anymore. Yeah. Then why don't you need carbon anymore? Because you've actually built the foundation for the sector to proceed. And the key thing is, again, considering the end game, but also making sure that we do the research to be able to come up with these in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, net zero, we have to reach net zero in 25 years, and that's where we need to be. I'm cognizant of the time. Maybe we can wrap up. You can give us a little bit of a sneak preview into what the next chapters are going to tell us about.
So the next week will be about additionality, so putting forth a kind of a theory and a framework for how we think about additionality in the context of projects that have an underlying economic rationale to them. The week after will be projects that don't have an economic rationale to them, where I propose that actually we need to be working much more closely with governments, and that the market, especially the volunteer market, which has up until now been resistant to embracing government participation. Actually, I think we need to flip the dialogue and actually embrace government participation. Because I think that for those projects that don't have an underlying economic rationale, government participation, regulation in the future is one of the key likely solutions to ensuring a longer term transition. The week after will be about natural climate solutions and how we need to break down the silos between these different crediting types so that we can actually use carbon to manage entire landscapes. The week after, I'm going to be kind of revisiting the renewables question. Mm-hmm. Basically, the conclusion I've come to, and it goes back to the additionality tool, because it requires you to kind of assess, project to project, it ignores some fundamental things. And what happened in the renewable space is that we were forced to assess a renewable energy facility kind of within the fence, if you will, like within the fence, with a fossil fuel facility. Mm-hmm. And sure enough, today, renewables are cheaper, so they make sense. However, the key things that we missed were the fact that most fossil fuel facilities are right next to the grid.
Yeah.
And most of the renewable facilities are way out in the middle of nowhere, or the kinds of renewable facilities we need to kind of reach kind of net zero and mm-hmm. kind of electrify and decarbonize our economy. They're way out in the middle of nowhere. There's no grid. Mm-hmm. And we need storage. So we've completely missed the boat on what we are trying to achieve. Mm-hmm. Again, did we achieve emission reductions? Yeah, great. We did. But did we achieve a transition? And actually, I believe that we have not yet done that with renewables. So I think we need to revisit renewables, particularly because we've known that carbon can actually be a really effective way of supporting that particular sector. Carbon worked really well in renewables. It deployed capital at scale. Many people argue that it was an additional, all that stuff. Regardless of that, carbon was very effective. And certainly, the early days of the CDM, carbon was critical and really helped drive a lot of the development of renewable energy projects in the early days. So I think that there's something there. And then the final chapter will be some reflections about kind of the challenge that we face from a climate perspective, this thing about the net zero curve. What does it look like? What does it imply? What are the implications of it? And what does it mean for how we handle or how we treat carbon today? And what I think is the imperative to think about carbon with a bigger, more explicit objective at ensuring the transitions we need. And then just some final concluding thoughts.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind picking up with you every couple of weeks to see how the discussion is going and maybe amplify it, push it out to a wider audience.
Yeah. No, exactly. No, absolutely. I'd love to. I would love to kind of pick this up. I'll reach out to me. I mean, I'll let you read, and now and I can, we can touch base. But I'd love to kind of have an ongoing conversation about this. It'd be great.
David Antonioli of Transition Finance, wrapping up this edition of Bionic Planet. If you think I'm doing a good job of helping people see the signal through the noise and you want more and better episodes, then you can help me deliver them by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Bionic Planet. That's patreon.com/Bionic Planet. Likewise, if you're an ethical business looking to reach a global, climate-aware audience, then reach out to me about sponsorship opportunities. You can reach me at steve@bionic-planet.com. That's steve@bionic-planet.com. That's all for today. Until next time, I'm Steve Zwick in Chicago. Thanks for listening.